This is the Middle-earth philosopher. A lot of people love to dismiss the Hobbit Trilogy as the awkward and overindulgent bastard child of Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings adaptations. And in many ways, they're not wrong. The production was notoriously chaotic, with production delays, legal disputes with the Tolkien estate over royalties, and relentless studio interference that ultimately drove the original director, Guillermo del Toro, to walk away from the project, with Peter Jackson having to step in under immense pressure to basically salvage a project that was already buckling under delays and creative compromises. The result was a trilogy that lacked narrative precision and the emotional cohesion of its predecessor. But, much like my approach to The Rings of Power and War of the Rohirrim, I believe in giving adaptations a fair chance, and while the Hobbit Trilogy is far from perfect, I still came out liking the films and feel that it has a lot of merit and is even underrated by many people. And here are 11 reasons why I think that is. 1. Expanding the dwarves. The trilogy did for dwarves what Lord of the Rings did for the elves and men. It gave them depth, culture, and a history beyond Gimli's single dwarven presence. We saw a civilization that was actually rivaling the other civilizations of Middle-earth of elves and men, that was rich in pride, power, and art. Each dwarf among Thorin's group had their own distinct quirks and flaws, and yet they all shared the same core traits: fierce loyalty, stubborn resolve, a distrust of strangers, and a readiness to fight whenever pissed off. Long before Rings of Power gave us the Khazad-dûm in its prime, The Hobbit had already laid the groundwork for this. Number 2. The elf-dwarf rivalry. While Tolkien's books are more nuanced into the actual reasons for this feud, the film still leaned into the driving theme of the animosity between the dwarves and elves, and how that could even vary depending on which elven community that they were dealing with. Moreover, the prelude skirmish before the Battle of Five Armies actually started did piss off a lot of fans because it's not in the books. But, in my opinion, it was still more accurate. Historical tensions between these races have boiled over into violence before in Tolkien's writings, and the showcasing of that hostility gave that rivalry greater weight, as well as giving greater significance to the eventual friendship between Gimli and Legolas in Lord of the Rings. Speaking of Legolas, number 3, the inclusion of Legolas. Now, Legolas isn't in the Hobbit book, but as Thranduil's son, his presence does make narrative sense. Being more than just fan service, the trilogy gave us a slightly younger and more arrogant version of the elf that was still wise but not yet tempered by humility that we see later on. Legolas is more talkative and expressive than he is in Lord of the Rings, and, like most wood elves, is also quick-tempered. This is Legolas quite literally in his element, and that he would be slightly different than his presence in Lord of the Rings actually makes a whole lot of sense. In fact, I would say the trilogy gives his character growth, and moments like running out of arrows, or actually bleeding during a battle, broke this usual sense of invincibility that the previous trilogy had established. Now, the love triangle was unnecessary. I'm not going to argue that. But that's also easy to ignore. I simply press the skip button. Number 4. Bilbo's journey. Bilbo's portrayal was equally as more in-depth and nuanced from an already great previous presentation in Lord of the Rings. Before he became the eccentric recluse of Hobbiton, he was a typical hobbit just living his best life, yet had all the makings of an adventurer and someone who could actually deal with the realities of the outside world. The trilogy captured this evolution beautifully, from his riddles duel with Gollum to his tense exchange with Smaug and the settled beginnings of his corruption by the One Ring. Martin Freeman's performance gave us a Bilbo who was both endearing but also starting to become quite tragic. Number 5. The Battle of Azanulbazar. Lifted from the appendices, this flashback was one of the trilogy's most powerful moments in my opinion. and I've shared my views in depth on this before in other videos. But essentially, it showcased the dwarves at their most brutal, and why it's not a good idea to piss them off, thereby reinforcing Gimli's line in Return of the King about an army of dwarves heavily armed and filthy. This is not just a passing joke or reference. It's not in the original Hobbit context, mind you, but adds historical weight and emotional resonance to the story of the dwarves' history, culture, and motivations for the quest. Number 6. The appendices matter. Much of the trilogy's extended scope comes from Tolkien's appendices in Return of the King, which he wrote to better align with the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings books. Now, critics will often complain about the trilogy's length and even the fact that it's a trilogy at all. But these additions provide crucial context to major events in the story, like the reason behind Gandalf's absences, and the strategic importance of Erebor that kept motivating Gandalf to push so hard for the quest, as well as teasing us with the treat of a potential Smaug-Sauron alliance. All aspects that were originally written by Tolkien himself. Also, what is not well known is that Tolkien was never quite satisfied with how his universe came out towards the end, making adjustments here and there over the decades. He struggled to reconcile his stories into one cohesive timeline, and it's said that was even trying to do the same thing with the Silmarillion before he died. And I think Jackson's team honored that effort. Number 7. Smaug the Golden. Benedict Cumberbatch's Smaug is arguably the trilogy's crown jewel. More than just a flying napalm machine as dragons are usually presented at the best of times, Smaug was intelligent, manipulative, and terrifyingly unhinged. He was less of a dragon and more of a psychotic human being dressed in dragon scales. His psychological duel with Bilbo was more chilling in my opinion than his actual firebombing of Lake Town even. And yes, while the Erebor chase scene was overkill, Smaug's presentation definitely elevated the trilogy as a whole, and it did not disappoint the hype. Number 8. Thorin Oakenshield. Thorin is portrayed as a tragic, almost Aragorn-like figure, being noble and burdened, yet undone by his own flaws before he was eventually able to overcome them before his death. Now in the books, he is older and probably more crotchety as well, but this younger version is also still quite old and experienced. And while the concept of dragon sickness as a hereditary mental illness might be a bit of a stretch, it also added a layer of darkness to him and his family that made his descent into that obsession all the more compelling. His arc was one of ambition, pride, and redemption, embodying both the best and worst of Dwarven culture in one person. Number 9. Rivendell Reimagined. Now, some people dislike the visual effects in the trilogy, but I appreciated how Rivendell at least was expanded from a serene library outpost to a sprawling elven city that was alien and majestic and evocative of the Nodoran stronghold from the Second Age. It felt not only ancient, but worthy of the legacy of the Noldor and the subtle hint to just how different they were from the other elves that Tolkien wrote about. And as a fan of the Silmarillion, I appreciated that. Number 10. Elven Nuance. The trilogy avoided portraying elves, speaking of which, as a monolith. While they shared aesthetic traits, such as architecture and weaponry and ethereal beauty, their attitudes and mindsets varied wildly. The Mirkwood elves were proud, hot-tempered, and very insular, even in the books. And while Rivendell's Noldor were scholarly and diplomatic, they were also capable of violence, but the difference being that their violence was much more measured from past wars and experiences that the other elves didn't have as much of. Therefore, they did not choose violence as recklessly as the Wood Elves did. And it's a subtle but important distinction that, again, as a Silmarillion fan, I appreciate. Number 11, Supernatural Forces. The films give us glimpses into how the Valar, Maiar, and Eldar wage war with more than just weapons, but also with power. Galadriel's confrontation with Sauron and the Orc lieutenant was hauntingly violent, hinting at just how powerful the second oldest person in Middle-earth actually was. Gandalf's battle with Sauron underscored just how powerful Sauron actually was, and also hints to Tolkien's thoughts on why Gandalf in the books didn't want to step to his fellow Maiar in the first place directly. All of these effects Tolkien rarely described in detail in his writings, but the trilogy gave us a taste of their cosmic scale. So basically, no, The Hobbit is not The Lord of the Rings. It's messier, more indulgent, and burdened with ideas that had no business being there in the first place, but for just following Hollywood tropes. Yet, it's also rich with lore, character depth, and moments of genuine brilliance. And, after Rings of Power, it might be even more appreciated now for its commitment to Tolkien's spirit than it was before. Like with the Lord of the Rings trilogy, Jackson and his team didn't have to include as much of the Legendarium as they did, but they still did it, and for that I'm grateful, and it's for these reasons, among others, that I felt that the Hobbit Trilogy deserves to be considered a good set of movies regarding the world of Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. This is Miller Philosopher, and you guys have a good day.